Good evening and thank you for joining the session. We are focusing for the next 8 to 9 days on PMI-ACP certification. So to begin with, there is someone in this audience who's looking for practically using Agile. That can only be a byproduct because the focus for my training for these 9 days will be to look at how all you participants can get through the ACP certification successfully. I hope this motivation and objective is something that is shared by everyone in this audience. I will begin at ground zero. If some of you already know some of this, please forgive me, but I prefer to work at ground zero because I cannot see many of you and I'm not familiar whether you have these aspects at hand. If it is too basic, somebody can tell me to stop and I would go past that and go to the next piece. PMI-ACP stands for Agile Certified Professional. PMI is the Project Management Institute. We'll see a bit about this as we go forward. Let me just walk you through the slides. So, course details. As I said, this course is practically designed for you to go through the ACP exam. What it focuses on is the methodologies, the practices, and the tools and techniques that most Agilists would need. Of course, you will have some sessions which are simulated quizzes. I will try to bring some live case studies. There are best practice discussions also embedded within it. But really the whole focus of the course will be how to get through the exam, points that are relevant for the exam and which you should pay attention to. So at the end of this, of course, you should be able to lead and work with the Agile team, but most importantly, you should have the PMI-ACP tag. Pretty much you'll be good with the fundamentals, which would include how does an Agile development lifecycle work, what are the core roles, principles, and practices. As you will understand as we go forward, Agile is an umbrella set of methodologies. So it is not specific to a single methodology. And we'll see the various flavors of Agile as we go forward. We'll also understand the similarities and differences and best practices among these. So of course, as I said, there are roles and responsibilities. There are also activities that go on in Agile. So in Agile, we don't call these activities, we call them ceremonies. And anything that is an output, which is the artifact, is also available. They are very simple because the whole concept of Agile is around the KISS principle, or keep it simple and smart. Finally, of course, you should be able to apply the tools and techniques which are really part of the soft skills as well as some best practices for Agile project success. So when you look at the PMI-ACP exam itself, PMI or Project Management Institute says that when you're going through an ACP, it is essentially recognizing your expertise in Agile practices. Also, it is indicating clearly to employers or even your own peers that you are now competent as an Agile certified practitioner. Who benefits? Well, anybody who's a practitioner who would like to understand the broader concepts of Agile, those who are actually already using Agile, and as I said, Agile is never used in a purist format. There are several formats for it, several methodologies for it. So it's good for us to mix and match these, and it gives you a good opportunity to demonstrate your knowledge. Finally, of course, this will also help you to prepare to lead your Agile team so that you get the best benefits of agility. So when we look at Agile itself, it's interesting. I know that you work predominantly with IT, but Agile did not begin with an IT flavor. It actually began in the manufacturing sector. It moved and transitioned into IT, and today, as everything moves full cycle, we are finding a lot of Agile being adopted again back in non-IT domains, predominantly the banking domain. So almost all major banks, from Citibank, Bank of America in the US, to British banks, Standard Chartered, your Barclays Bank, they are all embracing it. So we can see that this cycle is moving across even non-IT domains. The benefits for you are obvious. that it is a state-of-art certification, unlike the PMP, which is quite old and mature, and needless to say, it's also pretty much passé because there are thousands and thousands of PMPs out there. On the other hand, the ACP is a relatively select band of people, so in that sense, you join a more exclusive band. The good news, the ACP is not limited only to project managers or those who are PMI, PMP holders. It can be open to anybody. Of course, again, with a disclaimer, there is a minimum amount of experience and educational qualifications required. We'll see that when we get to the next slide. So what do you need as a prerequisite? As I just said, obviously, one, an ambition to be certified as a PMI-ACP. And of course, the fact that you would have some requirements. So when you look at these requirements, they work in several areas. The first is an educational background. I don't think any of you will have a problem in this because essentially it says you should have a high school diploma or beyond. The next, well, I do know there are varying degrees of proficiency in this team, but what you do need is at least 12 months of general project experience, and that within the past 5 years. So I think pretty much most of this audience will have that, because I think we are dealing with an audience who is mid to senior levels. Okay, the next one is interesting. It speaks about 1,500 hours or 8 months of agile project experience. So what it's looking at is 2,000 hours plus another 1,500 hours. Please don't get very paranoid that you should have gone through the entire agile cycle. Even if you've done components of agile or parts of agile, and we'll be exploring those as we go forward, you will be able to show these or showcase these as part of an agile project experience. So we will deal with how to fill in the application, because that's an exercise by itself. We will deal with that at the fag end of the sessions when we get into next week. So just for you to keep in mind and to ponder over what are the possible practices you've used in agile. I guess some of you would have worked with agile, some of you may not have, but as I said, don't get paranoid. Even within traditional project management experience, many of us use agile practices, and of course we can, each of you can individually look back to those experiences so that we can fill this 1,500 hours of experience into your application. So give it a thought if you're not doing a core agile project, and we'll discuss it more as we go into the next week. Finally, you need 21 contact hours. So a contact hour is not permitted to be a self-study. So the PMI is quite clear that a self-study will not feature as an qualification of 21 contact hours. However, this training definitely qualifies. So these are the prerequisites that you would need to go through. Application process. So once you've got all this and you've decided what you're going to put into your application, the good news is the application is online. It's at this website, www.pmi.org. For those of you who've been through PMP, because some of you might have been through that experience, the good news is this is not as tedious as a PMP form, but you still have to go through the motions of it. If you are a PMP or a PGMP, the PGMP is standing for Program Management Professional, and I'm sorry I didn't mention it, the PMP stands for Project Management Professional. The two other certifications of the several certifications in PMI, but these two are the most popular. Then PMI actually waives 2,000 hours if you're already a PMP or a PGMP, simply because they've already verified that during the process of your application for PMP or PGMP. So once you've got this part clear, and let's presume you don't have PMP or PGMP, then obviously you'll also have to put in those 2,000 hours. So once you go into the site, you create an account. Now the account is absolutely free. You don't need to pay anything, so you can enter and create an account to pmi.org. Then you now have a choice to be a member or a non-member. So if you are a member, so you pay amount. So once you apply for the membership, it helps in two ways. One is you get access to a fair amount of material in the PMI site. And the second is you get the relative discount on the application fees for the exam. If you don't do that, then you'll end up paying anyway, because you'll pay the additional amount in the form of the exam fee. So it might just make sense to be a member on it. You can then go into, you'll find various options in it. and you will obviously choose the ACP option in this case. The ACP has a certification handbook. I have downloaded it and we'll see it as we go forward. Once we go through this, you select category 1 as member or non-member, and then you fill in the application form. Once you've been through that, you fill in the educational details. So for all of this, again, you don't have to give evidence, which means once you fill in the detail, let's say you've said that you are a bachelor's or a master's, you don't really need to attach the physical degree or a scanned copy of the degree yet. It's only if you go up for an audit that you need to do that. So you can fill in the form without any stress that you don't have the immediate copy of these educational details. But do remember, if you're called up for an audit, you'll need to have it. So then you complete your PM, that's the project management, as well as the agile experience validation, which is essentially the number of hours spent in various types of project management activities. Then online, you can send this application to PMI. You get to know your eligibility within 15 days or a fortnight. And this period now for the exam is good for you for 12 months. So anytime during the 12 months, you can check the Prometric Center closest to you, schedule the date of the exam. And of course, the good news again is once you complete the exam online, as soon as you pass it, it throws out a message saying, congratulations, you've passed. And of course, within 10 to 15 days, you will receive your official certificate all the way from PMI. So this is the process, application process, not terribly complicated, but you will need to spend some time around the education, experience, validation, and so on. So cost, as I said, PMI members $435, non-members $495. So as you can see, the difference is about $60, and that's what you pay if you become a member. So really it doesn't make too much difference. 21 contact hour training. Books you can decide to spend, I will show you the reference books. In my mind, you don't need to buy all these books, but let me not deter you. If you think you do want to have the official books, you could do that. However, for the purpose of passing this exam, you don't need those books. For a retake, $335, quite steep. Please keep that in mind. The number of questions, a total of 120. In the 120, there are 20 which are called pre-test questions, which means these will not be scored to give your eventual mark base. But we will not know which of these questions in the 120 are the pre-test questions. In other words, you'll have 120 hidden away somewhere which are not going to be scored for you, but you won't know which those are. Allotted time, very generous, 3 hours. So most people complete the exam in 2 hours flat, and then spend their time walking through the, the whole set again. So you need not submit your question paper. You can just mark your answers all the way through to 120 questions. You have time, you can go back and review them and only then submit the answer. So that in that sense, the exam is very generous. There's more good news. If you have a wrong answer, there is no negative marking. So that's also good news for us. So as I said, 120 questions across various domains. I will show you the domains in a bit because that's in the handbook, and information on what is covered in the exam is found in it. Now, some of you might have been through the PMP exam and you would have found that was very tedious. One, because exams become very cumbersome, and two, because it has a very large book called PMBOK, which stands for Project Management Body of Knowledge. It's a fairly laborious 600 or 650 page manual which you have to go through and wade through, and like it or not, you actually have to know some part of it by rote, which means there are inputs, tools, techniques, outputs, and at least 10 questions or 8 questions in the PMP figures on the actual piece of concept around that book. The good news in the ACP, there is no ACP book as yet. We don't have an ACP book. So that's good news. You don't wade through one particular book and learn it by rote. The bad news is, therefore, the dimensions of what the ACP exam could cover is also not limited. And the fact that Agile itself is not a core methodology but comprises of an umbrella of methodologies makes it interesting that we have a wide scope to cover. However, the good news, 90% of this is known to us. It's what the most agilists work with. So we should be good with 90 to 95%. 5% always imponderable, but we'll have to take that chance on it. Once you enter the exam, there is no scheduled break. The exam has actually been developed by a group of agile professionals. It is monitored through psychometric analysis. What does that mean? It essentially means that there is no cutoff mark for passing. We cannot say 80% or 90% or 92% is the marks for passing. What does psychometric means is they simply have to do what we call a balancing between various people who write that exam during a period, and they don't specify that period. It's possibly a month, or it's possibly dependent on the numbers. So if you have about 100 people, then it does a comparative analysis and decides what's the kind of scoring you would do. So it's some kind of cumulative grading that we do. However, there are a lot of enthusiasts out there in the market who have done research, and they've tried to find out what's the average kind of marks based on, their network of circles and others. So it looks like, and this is not officially put out by PMI, but it's something that we as enthusiasts have found out. It looks like the average scoring they expect is in the region of 70% for you to pass, which is not a very difficult score when we look at it. Obviously, the exam is based on the exam content outline, and we'll see that it's freely downloadable. So you can also see it when you download it yourself. We spoke about ACP domains. So domains are areas of practice, and you can see the domains over here. So what we have is a beginning with an agile principle and mindset. So I should also tell you, for those of you who might have been watching the ACP space, this changed recently. July of this year, they changed the syllabi, because earlier how the ACP ran was 50% ran on domains and 50% on tools and techniques. So in this sense, the ACP has made a leap of faith. They have now said tools and techniques are actually byproducts of these domains. So we're not going to mark you separately on that. They have mentioned the tools and techniques and skills and knowledge that they want, but they've said they'll all be locked into these domains. So if you look at the domains, there are 7 domains. The largest amount of weightage goes for the agile principles and mindset, what we call value-driven delivery, stakeholder engagement, and team performance. So when you look at this itself, you'll have a fair understanding that agile as a practice has a very different outlook from traditional waterfall life cycle. It's looking at a whole different mindset. It's looking not at a contractual basis, but at a client getting a value-driven delivery. It's also focusing hugely on communication by saying all stakeholders need to be continuously engaged. Most importantly, it says it's not an individual who will be important, but it will be the team in its entirety and its performance that is significant for an agile success. So if you look at these domains, they give you a very good set of clues as to how agile as a cycle is focused. Then of course we have to lesser priority but important for us, how do we plan as agile project managers? And you can see the word adaptive, which means that we can't be too focused on a preset template or a process or presume this is the way projects always work, which is very unlike the traditional PMI, PMP, which expects you to follow a preset cycle. Here it says you constantly adapt and you constantly embrace change. It's also talking about constant, almost proactive problem detection and resolution, and an inward focus on continuous improvement across various parameters like a product, process, people, and so on. So as you can see, the domains itself give a good understanding of how agile as a cycle is tailored. When you get your results, it's a pass or a fail, and it actually tells you about each domain. So typically this is very much like the PMI, PMP kind of proficiency level, which talks about proficient, moderately proficient, and below proficient. So based on the number of questions within each domain, you are marked along this. So when you have proficient, obviously you're better than average, moderately is average, and below is less than average. So this is good for us because we understand the areas where we could improve on or where we are strong on, and we could build on these practices. Once you get the ACP, your journey is not over. You actually have to maintain the certification. So some of you might actually be PMPs and you might know all about this. For those who don't, the PMI insists on what we call obtaining a particular number of PDUs. A PDU stands for Professional Development Unit. And it does expect you to continue to improve your knowledge and give back to the wider community. And that has to be done through your certification cycle. Typically, that's for 3 years, starting from the day you are certified as passed. So each PDU is equivalent to 1 hour spent. So either you can, do that in educational or self-study. So again, as I said, PMI is a very trusting body. It doesn't expect you to provide evidence. Once you put in your PDU saying education, pretty much it will ask you whether you read a book or you've attended some chapters. So PMI has chapters all over the world. So if you attend a meeting of that, you also get qualified for PDUs. Obviously, if you're going to teach someone on Agile, or you're going to give a speech or a talk or a lecture or a presentation, pretty much that also counts giving back to presentation, and you can add in those PDUs. So when you're doing giving back to profession, because people like myself who do training on it, very quickly we would have completed our PDUs. So we are not allowed to give all 30 PDUs only for professional category or training category. We have to give 10 for self-study because there's a self-improvement path that we need to show. So for those who are PMP, it may sound like a heavy burden because obviously PMP or PGMP also asks you to provide PDUs. The good news is you don't have to add 30 more. You just have to give 60 in total for 3 years. So, however, the ones in the ACP certification should indicate Agile. So you can't do traditional project management and put it towards your PMI-ACP certification. So this is about PMI-ACP. So I'm going to pause, take a breath, and I'm going to open this for questions. Any questions, feel free. Okay, so not everybody will be called into audit. They randomly call audit. First things, if you are a PMP or a PGMT, you will not be called for audit. Okay, that does not mean that if you're not a PMP or a PGMP, you're definitely called for audit. It's not like that. Typically, they will call randomly for audit. So you might have, if 4 of you apply, 1 or 2 of you will be called for audit. It does not mean anything sinister or significant. It just means that you have randomly been picked. Now, you have already declared that you have done X number of hours on general project management and about Y hours on your Agile, and you have declared your educational qualification. So when you're called upon audit, they will ask you if, let's say, you have mentioned that you have done 6 months on a particular project in your company. They will ask you to give you, for you to give details on that signed off by your manager, or if your manager has moved on, by any other significant superior in the organization. So it just means that a person in the organization will say, I declare Mr. X has actually worked on this project for a period of it. This was the project and this was his role, and it will be signed and faxed. Similarly, for your educational qualification, many of you are probably, BE, BTech, MTech, MA, whatever, but even a BA or whatever. You just have to have a scanned copy of that. You'll have to submit the scanned copy. So once you do that, they will just go back to your application and send it back to you. So unless they find something hugely out of whack, which mostly does not happen, you will go through the audit process. Okay. Does this training qualify for the 21 contact hours? Yes, it does qualify for the 21 contact hours. Can it be used for PMP? No, because this does not cover the PMP, which is a very different syllabi. This covers only the ACP, so it can only be used for ACP. We now go to what somebody asked me just previously on the exam content outline. So this is available, freely downloadable. I have already downloaded it for you, so you can have a look-see. In fact, PMI has made a small mistake in the examination content and exam handbook, which we'll see. I'll point it out to you. But for the moment, let's have a look at this. So as I said, many of the companies teaching ACP have not yet readapted into the new scheme of things, because earlier 50% went against tools and techniques and 50% against the agile domains. However, for people like myself, this is a relief, because the earlier syllabus did not begin with an introduction to what an agile life cycle is all about. Which is difficult because people do practice only some parts or flavors of agile, and they won't have a concept or idea of purest agile. So here we are actually seeing the ACP has introduced a part which is totally around this cycle of agile, the life cycle of agile. So as you can see, it's 2014. It's been recently reviewed and updated in 2014, came into effect from July 2015. So pretty recent. Up till August 2015, there was actually a discount for people who sat for that exam, but since that window is closed, unfortunately, you can't take advantage of it. So here is your answer. The domains and tasks are put out, 7 domains and tasks. We also have the tools and techniques and the knowledge and skills. This is available and I'll walk you through it. There is a mapping I've also done, which I'll share with you, how and which tools and techniques and knowledge and skills fit in across these domains. Okay, so there's also something called the role delineation process, where we actually have PMI walking through the RDS. I'll show you this in a bit as well. It's basically around the practices of project management. So let's look at this very quickly. Here we go. So like I said, I've already shown you this in a pie chart, but very quickly, when you look at the domains again, you can see huge emphasis in the first 4 domains, huge weightage there. So exams will have questions also linked into these weightages. So you will see, since we are talking about 100 questions, 20 being pre-test and scattered across, approximately you can expect 16 of the 100 questions out of Agile Principles Mindset, 20 out of Value-Driven Delivery, so on and so forth, just to give you an idea. So that's how this exam is structured. So you will get lots of questions out of the top 4 as compared to the bottom 3. Okay, so here we go directly into what each of these domains expect. So in the first domain, good opening to Agile, which was not there earlier. It talks about the principles and mindsets. When it says that, it also expects us to give you a flavor of 2 things. One is all the potential methodologies within of the Agile umbrella. So we have Scrum, that is the most widely used. Then we have XP that is used. Of course, we have other practices like Crystal and others, lesser known, but with some best practices around them. So we'll have a quick introduction around those. Then we go into value-driven delivery, which again goes through looking at particular sets of subdomains. So these again focus not just on the value-driven results, but also how we can look at stakeholder priority, have stakeholders provide feedback on what we've done, and how we can use that feedback to prioritize and improve. So we also go after value-driven delivery into stakeholder management. Again, as I said, huge emphasis to keep the whole body of stakeholders together by ensuring that we build an atmosphere of trust, ensure we meet their needs and expectations. Also, keeping in mind our costs all the time, because cost is something that a customer is particular about. And of course, the best way to do this is participation and collaboration. So most of us who are in project management actively in the IT world will find this very interesting, and possibly will be a little cynical about this, because honestly, real life, we don't work like this, right? Pretty much all our companies have contracts with customers. We treat any change if not with suspicion, definitely with a kind of resignation, because it means that we'll have to go through a change request, we'll have to actually see the impact of the change, we'll have to decide if it's really a large change, whether we need to go back to the contract, put an addendum to it, have the customer agree to the pricing. So it's all pretty tedious. Here is Agile saying, don't bother about all those parts, embrace change, talk to your stakeholder, have a close collaboration with them. keep accepting what they give you. So this can be pretty scary for traditional project managers because we don't work in our business this way, and obviously our business cannot suffer if profitability doesn't happen. So, for those who are cynics, hold your cynicism. Agile has a very intelligent way of dealing with it, and when we go into the Agile life cycle, we'll see how we do it. So it begins to make sense. And it's also therefore important that everybody in this group who's going to use it practically looks at it very closely, because we have very, very smart customers who come to us and say, you know what, let's do an Agile project. It's great. You guys will win, we will win, and all of us, will get along well together. And then they start putting huge amounts of pressure on you because they keep on bringing in change. And there are, for every pro that a customer has, there also has to be a pro for us, which means we have to balance it out. And if we don't know our Agile concepts well, we don't put those in place. So we end up in a traditional mode where we are listening to the customer all the time, but we are also taking more and more change from him, and we are accepting it and not doing a proper impact, which means our teams go under huge pressure and they flounder. So for those of us in traditional cycles, I will point them out, though it's not part of the course. I will point them out briefly. If somebody is interested on a practical note, we'll have to take that aside on a separate set of sessions or a separate 1 or 2 hours and talk about those challenges. But needless to say, for those of you who think this is not practical, there are quite a few good mechanisms built into Agile. Be sure when you do a practical Agile project, you deal with your customer firmly and ensure that you have those pieces in place. Yeah, this is just, this is not strictly within of Agile, but just for you to have that that piece in your mind. Then we go on to the team performance. So this again can be a challenge for many of us in the team, because my guess is that most of you are already project managers or program managers or even delivery directors. Now in Agile, purist Agile at least, there is no concept of a leader leading the team. Every member of the team is considered a peer, and really you don't have a concept of a leader. So they expect a leader to emerge as part of some kind of consensus as the Agile project goes forward. Now that's very scary again, and you'll be asking questions like who gives the status, who becomes accountable and responsible, because these are the traditional roles that a project manager or a project director does work on. So we'll again see how Agile works with it, again quite intelligent. Though there are peers, there are specific roles and responsibilities, and those are fixated. And we'll find, though Agile doesn't specifically say it, it leads to a concept of first among equals. So we will see that when we go through Agile as well. Adaptive planning does not mean no planning. So a lot of people think adaptive planning means, great, I don't write my project plan, I don't update it, I don't bother about it, I do an adaptive plan, so don't bother me with those details. Quality guys, don't bother me because I'm an Agile specialist, so I don't need to produce all those bothersome artifacts that you need. Far from it, Agile does have artifacts. It's built in a slightly different format, and we'll see it. How to plan can be also pretty strenuous. So for those of you who believe that Agile is a fun way to work, let me hasten to tell you, I've handled about 250 Agile projects, and they are huge pressure, they are pretty intense, and they also presume a high level of maturity and a high level of competence within the team. So these are things that it would be good to remember, because if not, you'll find that Agile will put terrific amount of stress on you. We also talk about problem detection and resolution. So throughout, because you are having effective engagement with your stakeholders, your team is under pressure, there will be problems coming up, could be technical, could be non-technical, and there is pretty much a very quick turnaround to be done in the course of this. Finally, Agile also expects you to improve with every learning and iteration. So continuous improvement and how it's built in. So all of these are the 7 domains in Agile. Obviously, the first 4 play a more significant role. The others also have significance, but they do not have as much for us to learn from as compared to the earlier parts. From an exam viewpoint, obviously focus on the top 4, and the other 3 will not have too much. It's pretty simple to walk through. So we go on to the domains. Within each of these domains, PMI has painstakingly put out what they call tasks, and they expect us to actually know details around these tasks. So I will be walking you through, because this is totally focused on the exam, on task by task what you do need to know. But before of that, you need to know what is agile, what are the flavors of agile, how does a typical agile life cycle work. Without that, these tasks may not, come through as well. So we will look at that before we go through this, but this is just for you to have an understanding. Don't get too hung up on each of these tasks. Just have an understanding that questions will come through on this. So just because we are having a 19% or 18% doesn't mean task one's going to have one question and task two questions. So don't get too hung up on doing the micromanagement around it. Just make sure that you at least know these tasks. From my part, I will be touching on all of them. So I don't think you have an issue. Okay, so we then go on to the value-driven delivery, which again here is broken into what they call sub-domains. The first is positive value, where it has these 3 tasks. How to avoid downsides during the project, again 3 tasks. How to prioritize an important piece, 3 tasks, and how to do incremental development. Then we go on to stakeholder engagement, which should include your team, include your customers, include anybody as part of your value chain essentially. And then the stakeholder involvement, expectations from stakeholders, which we'll find. How does the team perform? So again, you have some subdomains like the formation of team empowerment, collaboration, and commitment. And then of course we go on to the planning types, levels of planning. So how do you do sizing, estimation? So more around the fundamentals of how we run a project. Then we go on to continuous improvement. So a lot of it focusing on your quality assurance methods, much of it coming through pretty much automatically out of the cycle, but some parts which we do need to do. So for those of you who have been into Lean or Six Sigma, parts of what you've learned there will be useful, because we do have Kanban and other principles also built in here. Okay, so here we come to the question. So very much though we went through those 7 domains, here we have the tools and techniques. So if you look at agile analysis and design, our guess pretty much would be that this would be part of the development life cycle, which is adaptive planning. But some of these not necessarily fit there, will also fit into concepts of agile value and principles. So that is why they have not put them across each of those domains, because these will cross-section across many of the domains. But obviously analysis and design, large part of it will fall into the life cycle of an agile project. So if you look at it, things like story maps and others are part of development, but we might find some parts like learning cycle, collaboration games that could also go into continuous improvement of people and so on. So that is why they have not segregated it. They have given marks across the domains and told us that also make sure you fill these concepts. So we will be filling in these concepts as well as we go through. Part of it will go in as we are learning the 7 domains, but part of it will also be dealt with separately as I go through. So again, as you can see, communications would fit obviously into stakeholder engagement, but would also fit into part of your development life cycle, because you do need communications there as well. Interpersonal skills across all the domains, matrices obviously most likely to fit into your continuous improvement and your adaptive planning. So this is more around your, your artifacts for quality and so on. For those of you who deal with the CMM components or ISO components, this will be a relief, because you'll see, that measures do come out, or matrices come out. Planning, monitoring, adapting, again, very much into the waterfall cycle of agile. Process improvement, obviously in process improvement. Quality, again, in process improvement. Risk management across several domains. Value-based prioritization. So for those of you who've done PMP, some of these terms like ROI, NPV, IRR will be familiar. But for those who are not, we'll anyway be touching on these as well. Okay. review it within 10 days, and then you also have to pay for the exam to schedule it. In case there is an audit, they will let you know, and you'll have 90 days to send it. They will process most of the document 5 to 7 days and come back to you saying you're now eligible. Then you go on to do the exam scheduling on a Prometric Center site, for which you have 1 year from the date of application. You can also reschedule if you want with some set of preset timing. So I think they give you 1 or 2 days in advance when you have to tell them, in case for some reason you can't take it on the scheduled day that you had asked for it. So once you pass the exam, your certification cycle begins for 3 years, and you need to get those 30 PDUs. Okay. If you don't, every year you also pay to continue to renew your certification. If you don't have your 30 PDUs, obviously you have a problem. Your certification will suspend. Even at the end of suspension, if you've not done anything, then obviously you are now, it officially expires, and you'll have to again need to rewrite the exam. So the overview I won't walk you through because I think I've held on ad nauseum, so I'm not going to do that. Eligibility we already spoke about, so I'm not going to worry too much about it. I think most of you know about it now. Application, as you can see how to begin it. As I said, you can write it, it's online, so you can go in and put it in. How do you record your experience? So it's possible you're working for several projects at the same time, and you can also give the details of those projects simultaneously. Obviously, however, you cannot show a 24-hour day. So if you're working on project 1 and 2, the maximum you can probably show is a 10 or 11 hours for that day. You can't show, 24 hours because that's not practical or possible. So many people surprisingly trip up on this, and that's when they get audited. So be very careful if you're showing overlapping projects. Make sure you're showing the right amount of time in the load. Then you need to show your agile project experience of 1,500 hours, and it should be separate from your general project experience, so you can't combine the two. Record your training of 21 hours. So I will be producing a certificate for all those who are in this class. So you will be just scanning that certificate and giving it to PMI. I don't think you will have an issue with that piece. And what they are very clearly saying is, do not think if you do a self-directed study or you just go to a chapter meeting, you can show the 21 contact hours. It can't be done on that. Okay. Application processing, they've given their turnaround times. We've talked about the fees. So I think we already discussed this. $495 if you're non-member, $435 if you are a member. Membership also is around the same differential. So it should not be an issue. Re-examination. So all the other potential costing. How do you submit the cost? Very simple. You can just pay for it online through credit card. Many of you are in the US, most of you in fact, I think. So you could also do a wire transfer money order or a check. Refund policy, it's given you details of refunds. In the rare event that somebody fails the audit, then they have that. Then if you are in audit, so somebody asks this question, they've told you very clearly what all they want, which is essentially copies of your educational qualifications, signature from any supervisor or manager from the project, and copies of any other certificate which you will have from me to give in terms of training. Policies and procedure, already we spoke about this, we talked about the time. We talked about the fact that it's in Prometric Center. So here's where they've made a mistake. Initially, they had this 50%, 50%. This has now changed, but this particular handbook has not yet been revised to reflect that. So for this, please ignore this part, go to the examination content outline and look at it. Though this is the latest copy, it seems to be some mistake. I think they will come back and correct it. So examination, as I said, on a Prometric site, usually it's not on paper because most parts of the developed world and developing world have Prometric centers. So in the rare part that you are in deepest Africa, you may do a paper-based one, but almost otherwise we do it on a Prometric cycle, Prometric site. Policies and procedures for those who are handicapped, who have some other issues, they give you some special considerations, and they have some legal constrictions. Most of us, I don't think you'll have it, because it's only on the sanctioned countries like Iran, Sudan, Syria, and Cuba. So unless, since none of us are, residents from there, I don't think we need to worry, or we are citizens of those countries. Okay, then your exam eligibility, blah, blah, so on and so forth. So all of this is pretty much what I spoke to you about and how to follow it step by step. So I don't want to spend time on you looking at it. However, I recommend that please do read this material once we are through with today. And if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to deal with it. But most of this is fairly self-explanatory. So they're just giving you a lot of examples, talking about how you handle it, what do you need to prove who you are. So they don't want somebody else coming and writing the ACP exam on your behalf. So they ask you for some forms of license or some other form of identification, and they mention that library cards or social security cards are not forms of identification. Okay, then they've talked about what you cannot bring into the exam centers. When the exam center person can throw you out if you have violated some rules, and then how you read your report, appeals, and using your certification. So pretty much it's very comprehensive. It's got 60 pages and talks about all the pieces that you need to look at. These are all on how you can continue to have the PDUs. So a lot of this is there on PDUs as well. For those who hold multiple certifications like PMP plus ACP or PGMP plus PMP, things like that. So all of this and a certification. So these are fairly self-explanatory. I'm not going to walk you through those, but understand that these two will give you a lot of detail, which is the certification exam outline and the practitioner handbook. What I also walked you through was what we call about the PMI-ACP. So now we'll launch directly into not domain 1. Though domain 1 is a logical start, what we are going to do is a quick and dirty review of what is agile and agility and so on, so that it sets the context when we walk into the domains. So the domains, as you would have noticed, are structured into little building blocks. But I think it's important that you have a big picture first, and then we go into those building blocks. We will explore more and more detail, but for those of you who are not familiar with Agile, there's possibility that some of you have just read about it or have not practiced it in its entirety. Important for you to have an understanding of how Agile works as an entire concept from end to end, and then we can go into the building blocks. The word agility itself, most of us have a mental picture of something that's pretty, fleet of foot or swift or, something that typically means moving rapidly. That's the feel of agility. For some others of us, it also means flexibility, things like that. So if you look at the word agility, typically as an adjective, it could mean many things, but typically it means responding fairly rapidly and responding with, taking into advantage adaptability, flexibility, responsiveness, and so on. So when we look at the Agile methods, typically Agile also follows the scheme in which it looks pretty much at what we call values and principles. So this particular piece, I would recommend you look at carefully. Also, please, in the interest of the exam itself, understand the words very closely, because the exam will have at least 1 to 2 questions across these principles. It will ask you questions around this. And it pretty much plays around those words which you have in terms of values. So we'll look at it a bit more when we go into domain 1. For now, just understand these, they're quite simple. So what Agile methods basically talks about is, it focuses largely on a face-to-face personal interaction with your client, and it talks about working on that project closely, collaborating with the customer. Okay, we'll see how we do that when we go into the life cycle and what is the role that will fulfill that. But let's understand quickly the building blocks for Agile principles. So when we look at the building blocks, one is obviously customer collaboration. The second is because it's based around humans, how individuals work either within of our team or even across teams or even with our customer, and how we interact with them at any point of time. The third is interesting. They are saying that we have to deliver what they call a PSI. A PSI stands for potentially shippable increment. In the agile world, PSI is a term used in equivalent to what we in traditional software talk of as a deliverable. So we talk about this output as a deliverable in traditional software. In the agile world, it's called a PSI. Now, in our world, when we talk about a deliverable, sometimes a deliverable could also be a manual or a document. It need not necessarily be software. But in the agile world, purist agile insists that every PSI, potentially shippable increment, is a piece of executable software, which means the software technically should be able to work. So in other words, agile says, do not give me a lot of documentation and say, here's your documentation, the software will follow slowly but surely. I do not consider this as a PSI. A PSI must be a piece of working software. So we are talking about a software lifecycle which is iterative and incremental. Because in our traditional waterfall cycle, we typically develop small pieces, but we do system testing and integration testing fairly late into the cycle, almost at the fag. But in this particular case, it's expected that you go through unit system and parts of the modules should be developed and produced as a executable and standalone. So it expects a working software very rapidly in Agile and very quickly in Agile. Finally, very interestingly, it says respond to change. When it says respond, it's not a response that pushes back change. It means embrace change. So it says, don't say, here's my project plan, I've baselined this, too bad buddy, you want to change, send me the change request, I'm going to do a change impact, I'm going to send you back the effort and the cost, agree to it, I will then build it into my plan and I'll build a new baseline. What they're saying is, very much respond to change, make sure that you are going to take it on and you're not going to worry about your plan and your baseline and all of that. So the essence of Agile, if you look at it, huge amount of interaction between customer and the team. Teams are also highly skilled. They'll have to produce frequent interactions. And interestingly, there should not be large teams. So when you look at Agile, and we'll talk about it, they say the team should have a maximum of 12 people and could be up to a minimum of 5 people. So that's the kind of span of teams that they're talking about. Now again, many of us from a traditional world will say, hold on, there's huge amount of software, a team of 12 people can't possibly develop it. How are we going to go forward with this large program or this very large project? So what we do is called scaling. So if you have a very large project, we actually break up into many teams of possibly 12 or 10 or 5. Sometimes if the project also includes components which are specific to, let's say, embedded software or hardware or databases, we also build the teams around those particular core competencies, and we scale up these multiple teams to work either parallelly or, you know, sequentially depending on it. So this is how Agile works. It includes a lot of adaptability, or in our terms flexibility, and iterative development, obviously. Why do people use Agile methods? Well, in today's world, we can't wait for a product. If you're going to wait for 3 years, by the time the product comes back or comes out, it's probably obsolete, at least in part. So people expect it to come out very quickly. The time to go to market should be very short. Obviously, it's got good cost efficiencies, and because of the way it works, there is a better emphasis on quality, satisfaction, and success of the project. For those of us who think Agile are a hot new kid off the block, actually it's pretty old. It started right up from 1984. So possibly some of you were just born at around that time. So it's not very young, is what I'm trying to say. As people consider maybe it's last 7 or 8 years. No, it's a flavor that's been around. It's been given different names. And today we see a lot of interest in Scrum, but even Scrum is not very young. Even Scrum has been around for some amount of time. What are the methods that are most common? So when we look at the methods, we'll find Crystal. So Crystal was actually invented in IBM by a person called Cockburn. Today, obviously, he's no longer with IBM. He's taken the methodology and he's marketed it effectively, but it began in IBM, and it has a whole set of best practices. But the one that we would link it most closely to is what we call use case. So maybe some of you have worked with a unified modeling language, or UML. So UML, which is actually part of object-oriented design, analysis and design. So UML is fundamentally based on design, which is built around what we call a use case model. So the use case, if many of you might have seen it, it looks like a set of stick figures with an activity around it. It's pretty simplistic to understand, but it's something that communicates well. Both the software developer and the domain specialists can adapt and understand the use case because it is depicted in a business sense, but still can be used to build the pseudo logic for code. So use cases, something common, come out of UML. Of course, Rational initially had it. Today, Rational has, of course, has been bought over. So the next big piece and the most common flavor of Agile is Scrum. So Scrum began with a gentleman called Sutherland in a company called Easel. Obviously, Sutherland no longer with Easel now. He's moved out, and Scrum is his hot property. He's put a copyright on it, and it has its own features. The most significant best practice is something called a backlog. We'll see what is a backlog, but a backlog is not what you and I would presume it is. So for us, a lot of us, the word backlog simply means the work that's accumulated and we have to pick up and do. Okay. In this case, and that's usually with a negative context. When we say we have a backlog, we say, oh my God, I got this backlog, what do I do? In this case, a backlog is, of course, all the parts of the product to be built, but it's simply a way in which you prioritize the work within of a product. So it's not a negative context, it's in fact the way Agile and Scrum work. As in the world and the great divide between the European community and the US community, the earlier ones of Crystal and Scrum have come largely out of the US. We do have a methodology that came out of Europe, typically out of UK. The DSDM, or the Dynamic Systems Development Method, has come out of a firm called DSDM out of the UK. Not as widely known or acceptable through the community, but it does have some good best practices, best pieces being user involvement, which I think is always good in any case anyway. Then we have some other pieces which also came out of Europe. So we have Nibelon, a gentleman called De Luca, who does FDD, or feature-driven development, where he's given a best practice which is called feature list, or the customer needs, which are taken in and built as tasks. Then, of course, the other big piece that was used extensively in Chrysler from Beck, which is extreme programming. So as you can see, some of these companies are not from an IT output. So the best practice here is release plan. We'll see what that means as well in a bit. So these are the flavors of Agile methods. So when you look at this, as I said, many of these are pieces that have been embraced more widely than others. I'm going through these because it's possible you may get some questions around it. So as I said, Crystal Methods out of IBM by Alistair Cockburn, 1991. Don't worry too much about how many roles it has, how many products it has, and practices. Just be aware there is a method called Crystal, and you have flavors of Crystal. So you had Crystal Orange, Crystal Yellow, Crystal Clear, and so on, which is basically the amount of complexity within of an Agile project. So don't worry about the roles and practices. You won't get questions around that, but certainly you need to know there was a method around it. Scrum, you will get most of your questions focusing around Agile and Scrum. So pretty much it's something that we'll look at in much more detail as we go forward. the 3 roles in Scrum are also the 3 roles of Agile. So we will see these terms. I think I had already mentioned to you all that there were 3 roles, and it's maybe time to talk about those 3 core roles. So the 3 core roles, one core role obviously is the team, the development team, simply called the team. So if it is a Scrum team, it's called Scrum team. If it's called Agile team, it's called Agile team. So that's a good piece. It's simple for us, and it's the part that is obviously a foundation for the building of a project. The second term is something called, somebody called Scrum Master in the Scrum world, or an Agile coach in the Agile world. We'll talk much more about the role of this person. It is not a technical role. It is more around, as I said, mentoring, leading, coaching, removing obstacles, impediments, so on and so forth. The third important role is a person who's actually embedded from the client side. And this role is important to us because this person is actually like a pseudo project manager, though we don't call them project managers. These people represent the client, come from the client side, and they are the people who actually work through the features or the requirements, as we call them in traditional world, from the client side. So these are the main core roles that we'll see. We'll see a bit more about these roles as we go forward. Just for you to understand it, in Agile and Scrum, we have the same 3 core roles. Some names are used commonly, some are used a little differently. Okay, so you will also, for those of you who've done traditional PMP or who follow matrices, many of us would have heard of a concept called EVM, or Earned Value Management. So pretty much Agile uses this methodology to understand where they are in terms of the Agile project. So we will look at this Agile life cycle and understand that as well when we go forward. DSDM, as I said, came from the UK. It was created way back in 1993. It is nothing but a rapid application and development approach, and goes through some stages like feasibility, and then your agreement on your plan, identifying the design and building it, going through several iterations, and finally going through implementation. Feature-driven development, where you pick up all the features or the requirements of a particular piece of software, then you pick up one of those requirements and decompose it into tasks or features, build all of those around a single feature, and then move on. So what it says is, we are actually picking up a particular requirement and trying to build it to finish before we go on to the next requirement. Extreme programming, again from Chrysler. So as I said, after Scrum, it's the next most popular piece. Lot of this is not followed in its entirety, but we do have parts of it like release and iterations, which we'll see in a bit as we go forward, which are also followed. So extreme programming, also something which is significant. The company itself is trying to promote it into a full-fledged cycle, but still today not fully accepted. So what is the release plan? So when we go through the cycle, we'll look at it, but for us to understand the hierarchy of planning, we begin with the release plan, which is a sum total of all the requirements of the entire project. And then we actually prioritize those requirements, and the first set of priorities begin with what we call an iteration. So here we have 2 terms, release plan, iteration plan. Release, sum total of all of the requirements, and an iteration is taking up a prioritized set of those requirements and doing it as part of the entire life cycle. So please be very clear to remember the difference between release and iteration. In the Scrum world, it will not be called an iteration, it will be called a sprint. So please, for those of you who are noting these differences of terminology, here you have yet another terminology. Like we had Agile Coach in Agile World with Scrum Master as the equivalent. Here in Agile World, we have iteration plan. In Scrum, we would call it a sprint. Okay. Now we also have another term called pair programming, which is the best practice. It's nothing but two programmers sitting on a common machine working on a single piece of code. So one person is coding, the other person as they code is reviewing online immediately and immediately trying to debug it and remove the errors around it. Obviously, it's highly effective. You're not going to see too much of errors. So the roles are not constant. After a preset amount of time, the person who's reviewing will now become the coder and the coder will become the reviewer. So it is a set of pair programming. This is typically used a lot in mission critical kind of applications where quality has to be really significant and we have to make sure there are no errors. So missile systems, mission critical, space missions, those kind of pieces. Otherwise, it is quite a huge overload. You're using two people for essentially one task. Refactoring. So it's another common term. For those of you who are looking at the exam closely, you will get one question on pair programming most certainly. You'll also get a question on refactoring most certainly. So what is refactoring? Basically, refactoring is reviewing the code that is in front of us without changing the logic of the code. You do an improvement in terms of either its maintainability or its readability. So its commenting and so on are what you review. So let me repeat this. Refactoring, a question that definitely will come up. What is refactoring? It simply means that you will not change the logic of the code, but you will improve the maybe the format of the code or the readability of the code and so on and so forth. So you will have questions around this. One question for certain, so please pay attention to refactoring. Test-driven development, also an interesting concept. So once a requirement is put out, the requirement is taken away by a tester who, without knowing how the code is written, will immediately start writing a series of tests to ensure that that requirement will be met. In other words, see all the possible details or conditions for the test which will make the code that is to come to him fail. On the other hand, the developer will be working on a code that will make sure it will pass the tests. So then we have an interjection where the tester runs all these tests. Because there is so much of rigor into those tests, almost certainly the code will break, and then the developer is a lot smarter and wiser after seeing the conditions, and he goes away to make it more robust, and the tester goes away to again make it more breakable. So it's an interesting concept to ensure that code becomes very robust. Then we have continuous integration. So because of the nature of Agile, where we have to develop working code very rapidly, there is a huge amount of emphasis put on what we call continuous integration. So most of this is done through tools. It's not feasible to do manually. So at the end of the day, when everybody checks in their code, there is an integration tool which will try to integrate the code and see if it will integrate together and work as an executable. It isn't as simple as it sounds, but at least the integration tool will throw out errors so that people understand some errors in terms of integration and work on it to make sure they handle those aspects. Release plan. So as we spoke, we had two components, which was the release plan, which was the sum total of all requirements, and an iteration plan, which was a set of prioritized requirements out of the total release plan. So this is a term that is used commonly for us to understand the entire set of requirements that are across the cycle. Okay, so please be aware there is a word called product backlog. So the product backlog is nothing but the comprehensive set of requirements. Building that comprehensive set of requirements from beginning to end are fitted into what we call a release plan. Yeah? So these terms are important for you to grasp. So please have a look-see at it. So when I say release plan, it does not mean the set of requirements as a requirement specification document. It means how we are going to build the requirements, the entire sum of them, from beginning to end of that particular project. The actual set of requirements are put into what we call a product backlog. Yeah, I hope this is clear. If somebody is not clear, please ask me and we can re-walk with it. We'll also be looking at it as we go forward. So like I told you, I have put out a picture here, so that typically a picture, as they often say, is worth 1,000 words. So I've put out a picture here which will give you a clear understanding of what's the difference between a release and an iteration. Interestingly enough, if we have very large products, for example, let's take a financial management system. Financial management system may actually have the core accounting system, which is your balance and your accounting pieces, and then you might want to append it or add on to it with let's say capital management, working capital management, and then on to some other treasury management and so on. So here you're seeing a financial management system which has number of releases, because each of these itself become a release. So we may have release 1, 2 right up to n. Each of those releases will be broken up into iterations, or in the world of Scrum, sprints, and each of those iterations or sprints are broken further into individual sets of requirements, which in the Agile or Scrum world we call stories. Okay, so let's look at the right-hand part of this particular slide. doing because I wanted something and I'm not seeing it coming out. Here, the customer themselves set the priority of requirements. They immediately within 6 weeks see some part of that requirement coming out. And therefore, it's exciting for them because they're saying, oh, you know, I'm actually seeing tangible progress. There is no argument whether this is the right piece because their representative has said this is the highest priority. So we are seeing some output called PSI, potentially shippable increment, within 6 weeks. That priority is set by the customer. So please be very clear on that. There will be scenarios which come up in your exam, which will give a question saying that, you know, the product owner put out this set of priorities and they gave these 6 requirements. However, someone from your organization came and told your team that here's something that is more important to focus on and you should be putting it in. And how would you react? So please remember, in all cases, the product owner is king. He is the first, he or she is the first among equals. He or she is the voice of the customer. They are the ones who will always set the priorities for the requirements. Yeah, so this is something important for us to remember in the world of Agile. Second interesting piece, who points out who does what in the team? So in the world of Agile, the teams are supposed to be what we call self-organized, which means everybody puts up their hand and says, here's a task that I'm good at and I can deliver, and they self-give themselves the task. So they nominate themselves and they pick up the work. So that means that nobody bosses the person and says, here's something you must do. It's something that is self-organized. And the customer is called every week, or the product owner in the absence of the customer will do what we call a review every week. It's a time set apart for 1 or 2 hours where the team will demonstrate how much they've done as part of their requirement. Each person will show it, and there will be a review and comments around it so that they can move on to the next phase or correct what is wrong. So weekly there is a review, and at the end of it, obviously because the review has been done, in effect we are saying user acceptance is being done in one format. So we will see good progress by the end of the piece. At the end of it, it's either done or not done. And if it is done, then they can move on to the next sprint or the next iteration. So now it's a good time for us to have a look at the overview of a cycle. So you're seeing a Scrum cycle. Agile cycle is identical. We'll also be looking at it. So let's see how it works. So the first thing is the global set of requirements for the entire project. As you remember, we call this a product backlog. The term product backlog is common whether it is in Agile or in Scrum. It is the sum total of all requirements. Now these requirements are first taken and they have to be plotted across the one release or multiple releases depending upon the number of requirements. So the sum total of requirements when they are planned from beginning to end are put into what we call a release plan. Then the product owner, who is the voice of customer, talks to his own backend customer team and other representatives and comes up with a list of priority of requirements. So now the product backlog gets reworked on so that the highest level priority of requirements are at the top and the lowest level at the bottom. The product owner now picks up a set of the highest priority of requirements and fits it into the iteration or the sprint. So interestingly and important to remember, once the time for a sprint or iteration is fixed, let's say 4 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever period we take, every sprint or iteration must have the same timeline, which means if you have the first sprint of, let's say, 3 weeks, every subsequent sprint will also have to be of 3 weeks. You can't have one of 3 weeks, one of 5 weeks, one of 4 weeks, and so on. Everything must be uniformly time boxed. We call it time boxed. Now that iteration or that sprint will pick up a set of prioritized requirements and the product owner brings it to a meeting with the team. This is where a whole set of negotiation begins, because the team may say, you got 6 high priority requirements, but in our period of 3 weeks, we do not believe we can complete it. Then the product owner says, Here's an understanding of this requirement in terms of the domain. These are the kind of features or tasks that you'll need to do to complete this requirement. And then the team looks at it, does some amount of estimation in terms of size and effort and time, and then they again revert to the product owner saying it can be done, can't be done, and the negotiation is typically done between the team and the product owner. Negotiation can be done by the team on the timing of the task or the feasibility of the task. What the team cannot do, definitely can never do, is say this is not high priority, move it out. So I'm emphasizing this because you will get a question in the exam where it will ask you whether it will give you a subtle scenario where it will say you decide that this as a team member that this is not of high priority, or somebody from business comes and says from your side of business comes and says it's not high priority, or even from a client business side comes and says it's not high priority. Please remember cardinal principles. The product owner is the only voice of customer, only person who can suggest what is the highest priority. Nobody else can dictate to the team, and none of the team members can make a change in terms of priorities. They can only negotiate on whether they can complete that requirement or not. So this is typically called a sprint planning meeting or an iteration planning meeting. It is not for a huge length of time. It typically is for a single day at best, sometimes even half a day. So once those negotiations are done, the final set of prioritized requirements are totally locked for that sprint or iteration. And that is now called a sprint backlog or an iteration backlog. So let me re-say this. The sum total of all requirements, product backlog. Prioritized requirements agreed and taken up by the team after the sprint planning is called either a sprint backlog in the Scrum world or an iteration backlog in the Agile world. I hope this part is very clear. These are fundamentals, so it's good for everyone to understand it. Then we go through a period. As you can see, they have given 4 weeks here as a maximum sprint size. In Agile, you have a window of 2 to 6 weeks. In Scrum, you have a 1 to 4 week kind of window for the sizing of a sprint or an iteration. As I said, once you've agreed on that time, every subsequent sprint or iteration will have to be for the same period of time. It cannot change over it. Now we'll see one more interesting thing. Once this has been fixed, there can be no change in the requirements. That means, though we like and embrace change in the world of Agile, during the course of a sprint or an iteration, we will not take a change up. Nobody can come and say, hey, you know what, I decided that, come back and tell the product owner, you know what, we decided something is important, please start working on it now. It cannot be accepted because that's all boxed and we have a deadline for it, so only those requirements will work. Any of those changes will be included into the backlog and will have to be reprioritized after the end of the sprint and iteration only. So again, you will get questions around this where there will be scenarios where, just like I told you, somebody important will come, the CEO of the customer organization, and tell the product owner, this is very important, drop some other requirement and rework. How would you react? So in all of these cases, very important to understand, we will not take up that change until that sprint is over. Who should handle such a situation is the next question. So the next answer to that is typically not the product owner but the Scrum Master, because this is an issue that the Scrum Master will intervene and tell the product owner, we will not accept these changes. We are in the middle of a sprint, so please go back and reprioritize the requirements for your next sprint and we'll take it up then. So important for us all to remember this part. Now, more pressure is built during the course of sprint or Agile because we have what we call a daily stand-up. What is a daily stand-up? The word stand-up itself tells you clearly. It means everybody will stand up. Why does everybody stand up? Because nobody wants to be standing for a long time. The meeting should end within 15-20 minutes. So everybody is given a couple of minutes to speak. So maximum time 30 to 45 minutes. So a stand-up is good because everybody's going to find their legs aching and they'll want to go away. So a daily stand-up meeting is a daily meeting that is run across members of the team. In the world of Scrum, it is also sometimes called a daily Scrum. So daily Scrum and daily stand-up meeting means the same thing. It is a meeting across the team members. Who are the team members? The core development team, the Scrum Master, the product owner. Who is the owner or who takes responsibility for the daily meeting? It is the Scrum Master who takes owners of this meeting. Now this meeting is not a long tedious meeting, nor does it have an agenda written to it. Clearly there are only 3 questions that each team member will answer. What did I do yesterday? What am I going to do tomorrow? And what have I had an issue with during the course of my work? So this is not a status review. It is basically the member explaining to the others how they are faring with their team. I'm telling you specifically not a status review because again this is a question that comes up in the ACP saying that somebody is standing in the side and they are noting that somebody has not completed their work, so their appraisal is at stake, so on and so forth. So please understand, it's not a status meeting. It is only a meeting where every member is talking about the progress they have made or not made. The reason being, if some other team member can help them, they would chip in and help them. Or if there is something else that they would need to work on because this needs a bit of a break, they can move on to those tasks and return back to it. So it is not a status, it's just an understanding of how each member of the team is faring. So we also at this point have to pause and hear a story called the chicken and the pig. Has anyone heard the story of the chicken and the pig in the agile world? Chicken and pig? Okay, so let's understand the chicken and pig story because we find the roles in agile are often called chicken and pigs. So please don't think these are derogatory terms. They are part of agile terminology, hence I repeat them. The story is also not mine, but popular in the agile world, hence important for you all to understand. They may come up as questions as well. So the story goes like this. The chicken obviously, as you know, gives eggs, and the pig is the source of ham and bacon and sausages and everything else. So as a result, the chicken decided it's a great idea to start a breakfast shop. So chicken walks to the pig and says, I have this great idea between you and me, we'll start a breakfast shop and we are going to have a great deal going because we have everything important to make it a success. And the pig thinks for a bit and says, thank you very much, but no, you'll only be responsible, but I'd be committed. Because as we know, the chicken only has to lay the egg, but the pig pretty much has to be slaughtered if it has to, give the outputs for the breakfast shop. So the story in Agile is important because every core member of the team, including the product owner and the Scrum Master, are treated as pigs. They become responsible and accountable and committed to the team. Everyone outside of that periphery is treated as a chicken. So these terms may come up during course of your exam. Please remember it. All pigs are those who are part of the core team, and chickens are those who are outside of the core team, who are stakeholders interested in the project, but obviously they are not going to be accountable and have their heads cut off for it. So the concept of running this daily meeting is all the pigs will speak, but the chickens can hear but cannot participate. So you might have the senior level bosses of your own organization and maybe the customer organization who may come in and listen to this, but they cannot give instructions, they cannot interject, they cannot ask somebody, why did you not do this, what's your problem, so on and so forth. They can only listen and be mute observers of the entire piece. The only person who can talk on behalf of the customer will be the product owner. All messages have to come to the product owner. So this is the concept of the daily stand-up meeting. Now the Scrum Master is the person responsible to run the meeting. If there is an issue or an impediment that turns up, it is the Scrum Master's responsibility to note this down, take it away and deal with it and turn it around so that it's no longer an obstacle. The Scrum Master is also responsible for discipline during those 30 minutes. What do we mean by that? Suppose a team member says, here's a problem I have. And the next member says, you know what, I got a great solution for this. You have to do this. And both of them start conversing. And, it breaks up the entire sequence of what is happening. The Scrum Master needs to step in and stop those kind of interjections. So the Scrum Master becomes responsible for ensuring everyone sticks to the agenda. Any issues that can be resolved by another member will have to be talked about only after the course of the meeting. I'm telling you this specifically because, again, there are questions that will come up, definitely one in ACP, with a scenario in which the Scrum Master will have to interject because there are people who are cross-talking, or maybe somebody is talking and two other members in the far corner are speaking to one another without listening to this one member. Again, Scrum Master has to call them to order. Suppose a member of the client organization who's not the product owner, who's listening, butts in and says, you've got to do this. Again, Scrum Master has to intervene. So from all this, I think it's clear that the Scrum Master should be somebody who's fairly senior, who has an understanding of technical pieces, though they may not do any work on it, so that they can handle the obstacles, or if somebody's stuck in a technical piece, know who to go to get that technical problem resolved. So this is quite a senior role. Typically, project managers with some amount of experience are the people who will actually work with it. So the next piece we go to is a weekly review. Important that some time is set apart every Friday or Monday, whichever is considered the period, when there is a short review done, either ideally with the customer, if not with the customer representative, at least to the product owner, so that some tangible progress is being made, acceptance is being understood, or a lack of acceptance, so that there's a correction course. This is called a sprint review. At the end of it, as I said, a working piece of software, typically called as a PSI or potentially shippable increment, must be provided out. And once that sprint or iteration is over, the group or team get together and they discuss a couple of things. Typically, what went well during the sprint, what didn't go well, and what can be done to improve or made better. So the retrospective is an internal briefing of best practices, lessons learned, and so on. The product owner may or may not participate. Most certainly the Scrum Master will participate. At this meeting, it's possible that more stakeholders could be there, like the customer organization members, not just the product owner, and they can also give feedback. So in the retrospective, all members can participate, and it's more of a inward introspective on how to improve or do things better. This is a typical cycle, iterative and incremental. So at this point, I'm going to stop because we are close to closure time. It's also quite a large bite for those who have not been into the world of Agile. So before we go totally away, I want to re-walk you through in summary what we've done today. We've had a brief glimpse of what is the PMI-ACP exam. All of us need to clearly understand this particular course that I'm running over the next several days and next week. Our focus to get each and every one of you through the ACP exam. It's not rocket science. They're just 120 questions for 3 hours, 20 of which are pre-tests, but we won't know which those are. There are 7 domains. Skills, tools, and techniques are embedded into those domains. We'll be walking through each domain in detail. We'll also be understanding, which of these domains have what kind of questions. In the summary format, I'll be telling you which of these questions are there. So once we finish that, we walk briefly through the examination content outline and the handbook, both of which are freely available, downloadable. Also the course, how you actually write the exam, scheduling it, so on and so forth. The next thing we then did was walking through a brief overview of Agile, understanding the term, understanding the various flavors, right from Scrum to DSDM, to feature-driven development, to test-driven development. We also understood best practices in that, some of which were release plans, some of which were refactoring, so on and so forth. After that, we then began to look at the end-to-end in a single snapshot, the one which is before you. which is a typical cycle, in this case called the Scrum cycle, but we also could have an Agile cycle. What we most certainly know, there are core roles in it, 3 core roles: product owner, the core Scrum team or Agile team, and also we have the Scrum Master or the Agile coach. These are the 3 core roles. These are the roles that are typically called pigs because they are responsible and accountable. All other stakeholders are called chicken. We also then understood very quickly some terms mean exactly the same, but they're called differently in Scrum and Agile. So we have an iteration in Agile, but we have a sprint in Scrum. We have the whole end-to-end planning of the requirements in a release plan, the entire set of requirements in something called a product backlog. These 2 terms are common across both the worlds of Agile as well as Scrum. Then we talked about a sprint, which is nothing but an iteration in the Agile world. We also understood these are time boxed into a particular period of time. They can vary from as little to 2 weeks to as much as 6 weeks. But once we freeze that box of time, every subsequent iteration or sprint has to be of the same period. That means if we have chosen 4 weeks, every subsequent sprint or iteration must be of 4 weeks only. We also understood that the only person who can discuss and understand the priority of requirements is the product owner, and he is called the voice of customer. Again, a question that possibly comes up during exam: who is voice of customer? Very straightforward. It's only the product owner. You might have it twisted into a scenario, but anyway, the answer will remain the same. It's only the product owner who can be voice of customer. And once these priorities are set up, another very important aspect, there can be no change during the course of the sprint. So if there is any change that needs to be introduced, it can only be introduced into the subsequent sprint and can be reprioritized only by the product owner, not by anybody else. So these terms are important for us to understand. The rest is pretty much simple. The set of requirements picked up for that sprint or iteration is called either sprint backlog or an iteration backlog. It varies in period. And every day we have a daily stand-up or a daily Scrum meeting where only 3 questions are fielded. These questions are not to give a status, but more for us to have an understanding of where each person is in terms of the work. And it is run by the Scrum Master, who is the basic person who controls that piece. No deviations or interjections or time-wasting tactics are allowed in that meeting. It's a short, brief meeting focusing on what is happening. And any impediments or problems are resolved by Scrum Master or to be taken away in a log to be handled by the Scrum Master. And every week there's a review of what has happened so far and some kind of acceptance from either an end stakeholder, but most definitely from the product owner. Finally, at the end of the successful sprint, you produce a working output called PSI, or potentially shippable increment, and there is at the last stage what we call an introspection of how the project went and what could be improved and done better. Here, other members or even the chicken can attend and give their feedback briefly. It is documented so that these are put into action for the next sprint or iteration. Okay, so this is what I think we should focus on for today. It's quite a big bite. Okay, so somebody has sent me a question here. I'm presuming this is the next question, which says, to whom does the PMI-ACP certification best fit? A product owner, team, or Scrum Master, or all of them? In my mind, an ACP is typically a product owner or a Scrum Master. But as I said, sometimes traditionally, you may not have those terms. You might just have a term called project manager. So even a project manager being an ACP, always a good piece to have as certification. So typically team members also could be ACPs. It really depends because the team is also quite senior and technically competent and qualified. Okay, any other questions? Any other questions? Okay, good. So that's a good piece. A lot of people have a doubt around it. So the product backlog is nothing but the set of requirements. In the traditional world, we call it a requirements document, right? Where we have all the requirements listed down. Now, what is the release plan? It is equivalent to your project plan, where you have put down which set of requirements will be done at which point of time. So your release plan is the planning detail across when you're going to do each requirement from beginning to end. Your product backlog is the actual set of requirements that will fit into the release plan. And the sprint backlog is the small set of prioritized requirements that you pick up to do first, because that's the most significant part to produce something of value.